Hello everyone, and welcome to Rome Retold. I am your host Tim, and together we'll be venturing on a journey to explore the history of ancient Rome. In today's episode, we're going to pause and change gears a bit and dive into the conflict of the orders, which is sometimes also referred to as the struggle of the orders. Now, this term refers to a specific period of social, political, and economic conflict which occurred throughout the early republic. Basically, there was a lot of leftover turmoil after the Romans created their new government, and they still had a lot of growing pains to work through. These difficulties started almost immediately after the Republic was founded in 509 BC, and the end of the conflict isn't dated until about 287 BC with the advent of a major legal reform that happened in that year. Despite that, a lot of the underlying economic and social problems were never actually resolved, and a lot of the problems that erupted throughout the late Republic, from the Gracchi brothers to Sulla and eventually to Caesar, a lot of these issues all stem back to the early Republic and a lot of the grievances that were never really worked out. Okay, so what happened during the conflict of the orders? Oftentimes, it's simplified as being a conflict between the patricians and the plebeians, but of course, when you look at it more closely, it's much more complicated. Although it was a basic conflict between these two groups of people, there was a lot more nuance to it. Now, if I were to try and summarize everything up front, I would say this. When the Republic was founded, only the patricians held political power. However, there were plenty of wealthy plebeians, and they wanted some political power too. They basically said, hey, we're just as rich as you guys are, why can't we hold office? And the patricians were unwilling to give up their special status, and so the wealthy plebeians couldn't do too much about it all on their own. So, in order to gain some of the political power that they were looking for, the wealthy plebs sought to gain the support of the entire Roman people and used this support as leverage to gain this political power. Now, the problem there was that the average plebeian didn't really care too much about who was in power, so long as they had enough money in their pocket and food on the table. Now, realizing that, the wealthy plebs took up the growing issue of land shortage in Rome, where land wasn't being evenly distributed between the rich and the poor. Basically, the wealthy plebs told the Roman people that the patricians were holding out on them, and that if the wealthy plebs gained the ability to hold political office, they would set everything right and allocate more land to the average Roman farmers. The wealthy plebs were basically trying to say, hey, support us, and we'll help you out and give everyone some more land. The patricians, who soon were faced with the possibility of an all-out rebellion over all of this, eventually granted the wealthy plebeians this political access over time. Now, the patricians were basically saying, whoa now, we don't want to completely upend everything. How about we give the wealthy plebeians the ability to hold a few political offices, and then we just drop this whole land thing? Because, of course, land was where the patricians derived their real money and power, and they didn't want to start handing a bunch of it out to all the Roman farmers. So that's basically what happened throughout the conflict of the orders, and the issue of land reform was ultimately dropped, and the average Roman was pretty much left high and dry, gaining almost nothing from the entire process. Essentially, the wealthy plebeians got what they wanted, and so they abandoned the Roman farmers. So that's just a very rough, bottom line up front summary of everything, just to provide an overview of where everything is heading. Let's now jump into what exactly happened and why everything sort of spiraled out of control. If you remember from last season, the Romans always believed that the patrician families were originated from the 100 prominent men that were chosen by Romulus to advise him when he first established the city of Rome and became Rome's first king. When the Republic was founded, these 100 families established themselves as the ruling aristocracy, and they justified this move by saying that because they had been handpicked by Romulus, a man who they now believed had been deified upon his death, they stated that they maintained a close and personal relationship with the gods, which meant that they were the most suitable people to run the government. Essentially, they were attempting to maintain power through religious justification, and in the beginning of the Republic, they didn't allow anyone else in Rome any say within the government. The Roman government was specifically centralized around these 100 patrician families, and from there, a plebeian was just anyone who didn't belong to one of these families, and they could be rich, poor, or anywhere in between. Now, initially, none of this was actually the cause for any concern. The first problem the plebeians began to raise under the new republic was money problems. And this is a fact which I think really kind of demonstrates that people haven't changed all that much over time. Historically, scholars of ancient Rome have placed a lot of fuss on the political problems in Rome and focused a lot of their rhetoric on issues of freedom and the right to vote in ancient Rome. But a lot of that is really the result of post-Enlightenment thinking, and which a lot of it stems from Edward Gibbon and his massive tome on Roman history. However, when you look closely at the root cause of most of these issues, the majority of the problems that were ultimately being raised revolved around people's finances, and that, quite often, the thing most average Romans cared about the most was simply their money situation. Now again, a lot of post-Enlightenment scholars tended to see the problems in ancient Rome as some sort of big struggle for personal freedom, but lately, modern scholarship has shown how this wasn't really the case. So again, the first problem that the plebeians raised under the Republic didn't really have anything to do with participation in government or anything like that, but it was actually the issue of debt, and specifically debt bondage, which was where many Romans had found themselves falling into slavery, or at the very least indentured servitude, as a result of unpayable debt. Now, this most often happened to regular family farmers who experienced multiple years of bad harvests in a row. So, when a year of a bad harvest happened, the average Roman family might not have enough food to feed themselves. So, they would borrow food from wealthy aristocrats, who, of course, had a surplus of farms and food. Now, the average Roman farmer would promise a certain percentage of the next year's harvest as payment for the food that they borrowed. However, if multiple years of bad harvests happen in a row because of bad weather or diseased crops, you can see how the obligations placed on the small Roman family might quickly pile up. If their debts became too high and they just simply got to the point that there was no hope of repaying, they would ultimately be forced into slavery for a certain number of years as payment for this debt. Often, if the male head of household went into slavery to pay the debt, it could mean the death of the whole family, because the ancient Roman family was extremely reliant upon this individual to maintain the house and farm. So, many times, parents were even forced to send their children into slavery as payment instead, so that the rest of the family could continue to try and work the land to survive. All of this became a rampant problem for many small Roman families, and they began agitating for some sort of relief to change the way that all of this worked. According to Livy, the patricians ignored these plebeian demands for change. They were apparently quite happy to maintain their current level of exploitation against the people. The plebeians scratched their heads on what to do, and they came up with what I would say is a pretty innovative and decisive solution. Livy tells us that in response to these growing problems, and to the fact that the patricians were ignoring them, the plebeians actually left the city en masse and formed their own community and government about 3 miles outside the city of Rome. They basically just picked up and moved. Now this was in about 494 BC, and this move finally captured the full attention of the aristocracy. Now they suddenly found themselves having the rug pulled out from under their feet, and with their city suddenly vacant, they were now the rulers of nothing. On top of that, at the same time, Rome was being threatened by an invasion of the Volsci, which was a nearby Italian tribe, and with the entire city vacant, there was no possibility of raising an army. All of this brought the patricians to the bargaining table very quickly, and they finally agreed to cancel many debts that were owed by the plebeians, freeing them from their heavy obligations and from their servitude. Now, there was another major reform that came from the compromise made in 494, which was the creation of the plebeian tribune. This was the first governmental office created that was to be exclusively staffed by the plebeians, and their sole purpose was to safeguard the plebeian people. The tribunes had the power to veto any laws passed by the patricians. So although the plebeians were not allowed to create laws themselves, they could now stop any unjust laws that the patricians might try and institute. This entire event is called the First Secession, which should indicate that there were several others. But the validity of the others is hotly debated by modern scholars, and I don't really want to get into the weeds on all of that debate. However, I want to be clear. The practice of debt bondage was not eliminated from all of this. And really, the main result was that, although the plebeians did have their debts canceled, and the office of the plebeian tribune was created, debt bondage itself was not outlawed or changed, which meant that people could still find themselves in the same situation again later. And, to give a spoiler alert, they did. Now, debt bondage was not outlawed because, and much of this was really largely pointed out by Timothy Cornell, who is an important modern scholar of ancient Rome, it wasn't outlawed because the patricians were heavily reliant upon the people who were trapped in debt bondage to work their vast farms and estates. Essentially, the patricians were kicking the can down the road. They offered some immediate relief to the plebeians and calmed everyone down in the near term. But long term, they didn't really do all that much. Although it was true the plebeian tribunes could now help safeguard the rights of the plebeians by vetoing any new laws, that doesn't really mean a whole lot when debt bondage is already legal. Now, to draw a more recent and tenuous parallel, it would be like saying that instead of actually abolishing slavery in America in the 1860s, it'd be as if the country had simply created a board of men that could represent the slaves and maybe veto any new laws that might come out. That's sort of all the patricians did here at this point in ancient Rome, which I would say helps highlight that it was all a bit ridiculous and, again, didn't really do all that much. For a long time, among scholars of ancient Rome, the creation of the office of plebeian tribune has been viewed as some great moment for the plebs. But recent scholarship has been able to help show that it really falls short of doing anything. Additionally, a lot of problems would stem from the office of the plebeian tribune during the late Republic, which we'll of course get into in later episodes. But I just want to highlight now how the office didn't really do much to solve the actual problem that the plebeians were having at the time, and later it did a whole lot to upend the entire Roman Republic. So again, the plebeian tribunes are quite often seen as being this grand office that protected the Roman people, but most of that is really overdrawn. So, okay, that's the main events of the First Secession. The plebeians did accept these compromises, and they moved themselves back into the city of Rome. But since nothing really changed, problems began brewing almost immediately once again. Bad harvests inevitably happened, the average Roman farmers didn't have enough food to feed themselves, and they were forced to take on more unpayable debts. The patricians took these people on as indentured servants, and they basically enjoyed more cheap labor while the average Roman family suffered. This was all exacerbated by the fact that as Roman territory was expanding in the Italian peninsula during Rome's wars with the Latins, Etruscans, and Samnites, it was really only the patricians who could afford to buy and work this new land. It was almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, because as the patricians acquired more farmland, they needed more people to work this farmland. And where could they get a cheap source of labor? Plainly, they got it by capitalizing on more predatory loans to the average Roman farmer, who would quickly fall into debt bondage. It's all that classic idea of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and the plebeian tribunes could really do nothing to help this issue. The plebeians eventually started agitating to have some of this conquered territory allocated to them to help alleviate their issues. Since the main problem was food shortage, if they had more farmland, most of them reasoned their problems could be avoided. In response to these demands, the Roman government actually began setting up public land, called ager publicus in Latin, and it was meant to be used as a sort of common, shared farmland for everyone. By designating some of the land that was conquered from our enemies as public land, the Roman government tried to establish a system that created various set blocks of land throughout Roman territory that could be set aside for anyone to come and use as needed to help supplement their own family farm. It was sort of like setting up a community garden, but on a massive scale. Now, this may sound like a great idea, but lo and behold, the patricians slowly began acquiring this land too, which really wasn't very hard if you remember that the Roman government was the patricians. Although the public land was set aside for public use, it still had to be maintained by someone. Someone still had to be responsible for presiding over the land and making sure that food was planted, pests were kept out, and so on. So, the Republic farmed out the maintenance of this land through government contracts, and you can probably guess that it was the patricians who won these contracts. Although it was in theory public land, very quickly you can see that it fell under patrician control, and they ended up just restricting its use to themselves. This is actually all very similar to the system of common land and then land enclosure, which was seen in 16th century England, if you might be familiar with that period of history, and it's something that Thomas More discusses in his book Utopia. So there's a little instance of how history can indeed repeat itself sometimes. Now, from all of this, there's little the average Roman farmer could really do, because who could he turn to? The plebeian tribunes could only veto new laws from coming into existence, so they really had no power to intervene in any of this. And the Romans could expect little help by trying to petition the government themselves, because the people causing this problem were the ones who ran the government. It would be like if you had filed a lawsuit against your neighbor for cutting down your tree or maybe dismantling part of your fence. If you showed up in court and it turned out the judge was actually that neighbor, well, I think we can all figure out how that court case is probably going to go. That was basically the problem with the public land in ancient Rome, and things began snowballing again very quickly. Because, as Rome fought more and more wars in the early Republic, the Roman men, of course, had to go off and fight. Now, I'll try and be a little bit fair and say that both the patricians and the plebeians fought in these wars, so I'll give them some credit and say that they shared the same danger and struggle of having to fight in these wars. However, back home, the patrician farms and families were affected much less than the plebeian farms and families by the absence of these fighting men, because the average Roman farm needed every single able-bodied person available to work the land. Often, the average Roman would come home from a military campaign, if he ended up coming home at all, to find his farm had failed to produce what they needed, and that they had to take on these predatory loans. Meanwhile, the patrician farms were doing just fine, and fresh from their military campaign, they could buy even more land. This again continued widening the divide of the rich and the poor. Okay, so this all sounds very depressing, but that's basically the overview of the root causes of the conflict of the orders. What happened from here? What more was done about all of this? Let's dive back in and take a look at what started happening next. According to Livy, the patricians finally decided they would try and help fix the problem in 454 BC, which is about 40 years after the first secession. The Romans had learned that the Athenians had actually experienced similar problems about 100 years before, and so the Romans sent a delegation of men to go to Athens and find out what the Athenians did to fix their problems, and then bring these solutions back to Rome. A board of 10 men was appointed once this delegation returned to Rome, and this board of 10 men ended up creating Rome's first ever written code of law. This is, of course, the now famous 12 Tables, a series of laws that were finally enacted to set everything straight. Previously, Roman law had simply been known or remembered by those in power. But by etching these laws into stone tablets, the Romans were making a move toward equality. Now, every man and woman could go to the forum and read the law for themselves, and make sure they were not being taken advantage of. It was something concrete that could be seen and touched, and I think psychologically, to have tangible, written laws does a lot for the human mind and spirit. The 12 tables are called that because they were written on 12 stone tablets. Now, there are more than 12 laws, although each table is typically related to a specific topic, such as Table 1 relating to laws on court trials and procedures, Table 4 relates to family matters, Table 7 relates to land rights and land crimes, and so on. We do not have any original surviving pieces of the 12 tables, but their entire contents were reconstructed by historians during the 1800s from various surviving fragments like quotes or other legal documents that drew on the 12 tables. The 12 tables were definitely a big, important document in Roman history, as it formed the entire basis of Roman law for 1,000 years, and even Cicero reported having to learn the entire 12 tables by heart as a child in school. All later Roman law was built upon the 12 tables, and it was absolutely a landmark moment for Roman and even European history. The 12 tables were finalized in 449 BC, and a new Roman law was also passed that same year called the Valerio-Horatian laws, which is just named after the two consuls for that year. The main thing this law did was it finally gave the plebeians the right to create their own laws. Essentially, it allowed the plebeians to form together in their own assembly and pass laws that would be binding on everyone, even the patricians. To use a modern analogy, the Republic had now created a lower house, so the average person could now participate in the government. So, did all of these things, the 12 tables and the Valerio-Horatian laws and the creation of the lower house, did all of these things do anything to help solve the plebeians' problems? Now, the answer is absolutely not. It did not help things. They were still pretty messed up. So, what went wrong here again? Despite the fact that the 12 tables was a landmark achievement, which in a lot of ways it really was, it just doesn't live up to Livy's proclamations that it was created to safeguard the people's rights. Because we have to ask ourselves again, which people were being safeguarded by these laws? Now, modern scholars have pored over the 12 tables and tried to make sense of it all. And when we look at the laws that were written within the 12 tables, you really get the sense that none of them were progressive. Almost all of the laws in the 12 tables maintain the status quo and preserve the rights of the ruling elite. These laws reinforce the practice of debt bondage, stipulate how a family must obey the male head of household, and stratified punishments and rulings based on your wealth. Looking at the 12 tables, it was not a document for social or economic reform, but it was one that solidified and maintained the power of the aristocracy. So why did Livy get this wrong? Well, it's mostly because he was part of the aristocracy himself, so of course he made the 12 tables seem like this altruistic thing that did something so great for the average Roman. Modern scholars have mostly teased out the idea now that there quite likely never was a Roman delegation that went to Athens to try and get ideas on how to solve their problems, and that this idea somehow came about as a fantastical invention. This belief is again mostly supported by the realization that the 12 tables did next to nothing for solving Rome's problems, but really just entrenched everything further. Previously, scholars remained fixated on the amazing achievement of Rome writing down their first laws, and they mostly overlooked the fact that these laws were conservative and reactionary. Basically, previous scholars of ancient Rome said, hey wow, Look at this great achievement of the Romans writing down their first laws, and that was kind of their main focus. They didn't really take that next step and look at what the laws were actually saying and doing. If the plebeians could now create their own laws, why didn't they create any laws to resolve any of these issues? All these problems continued on for quite a while, and so obviously we have to realize that there's more to the picture here and there's something underlying going on. In addition to all of this, I think it's important to mention that even though the plebeians could now create their own laws, this created a large imbalance in the Roman government. This imbalance wasn't fully realized until later, but it was definitely born here in 449 BC. Now, the plebeians could pass their own laws, but they could also veto any laws via the office of the plebeian tribune created after the first secession. The patricians had no similar veto power, and now, in one swift move, the plebeians greatly overpowered the patricians. Now, this could rightly be seen as just, after all the problems the plebeians had been enduring here, but I do think it's important to realize that this imbalance would snowball, and it's what caused so many problems in the late Republic and the eventual downfall of the Republican government. It can really all be traced back to here, to the conflict of the orders, and these ineffective reforms that were happening, and although it took a few hundred years, things eventually came apart at the seams. The 12 Tables and the Valerio-Horatian laws had brought a measure of stability to Rome, but they had not addressed the deeper issues that divided the city. Beneath the surface, the embers of discontent still smoldered. The patricians and plebeians remained locked in a struggle for power and influence, with each side now determined to assert its dominance over the other. The laws had provided a temporary respite, but the underlying tensions remained, waiting to boil over. And as the city looked to the future, it was clear that the conflict of the orders was far from over. The stage was set for a new round of struggle, one that would begin to test the very foundations of the Roman state. Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out our website at Retold.com, where you can find out more about the podcast and find links to other platforms for listening. You can even support us through Patreon, where you can help support the time, money, and research that goes into providing this podcast. You can also find the link to our Discord server, where you can join our community, ask any questions, or offer suggestions for future podcast topics. Or you can just join in on any of our discussions about ancient Rome. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.